Hello all. I've been wondering, what's the best way to juice a map when we look at data and math? How does increased quantity, rarity, and rare monsters compare to each other? Which one's the best? Are there any special diminishing returns we need to consider? To answer these questions with any confidence, I needed data. Side note, doesn't the outside look nice? So, over the past few weeks, I've been running hundreds of maps and breaches, killing 129,359 monsters, and picking up 11,897 items and tracking them in a spreadsheet to give us a starting point to do some analytics. How good is the test data? Is the data clean and reliable? Whenever I'm testing, I'm looking to isolate the variable I'm testing as much as possible, attempting to balance test noise with realism. First, I'd find two of the same map, each having breach. One map I would juice with tablets and waystones with the stat being tested, making sure that no other prefixes were there that would modify loot. The other map I would run with no prefixes at all that modified loot. In this spreadsheet, I also linked a screenshot of the entire set of map mods for each test. The spreadsheet itself is linked in the description. Since breaches can vary greatly depending on where they're located, I did monster kills as an equalizer between the two tests. Utilizing /kills, I recorded the number of monster kills per map and per breach. When I got to the end of the test, I would run extra breaches if needed to equalize the kills. To summarize, I ran two tests where the only thing different that modifies loot was a stat being tested. Let's dive straight in to increased quantity. Increased quantity appears to be a very straightforward stat. It increases the number of items a monster drops. Assuming there's no additive sources and there's no special diminishing returns, I'd expect 100% increased quantity to double your loot. This is a stat I tested the least amount, with only 26,000 monster kills. Why? Because the stat works exactly like you would expect, with maybe one small nuance. The baseline on the low quantity test was 105%, due to 5% on my Atlas tree. On my high quantity tests, my average increased item quantity was 118%. Mathing this out, this is 107% more, so I'd expect around 107% more items. So what did I see? Well, total currency up 112%, and total number of items was up 129%, clearly showing that there's no diminishing returns and that this is the best stat in the game. Now, as I said, there was one nuance. Breach splinters were only up 60%. I couldn't figure out why this would be the case until I rechecked my Atlas tree and discovered that I had plus 75% increased quantity of breach splinters. Thus, the data is showing that this Atlas bonus is additive with increased quantity. So in the case of breach splinters, if you have this Atlas bonus, 100% increased area quantity will increase the number of splinters you get by only about 60%. Another tidbit of information I confirmed is that increased area quantity does increase the amount of splinters you get from classed hands. In summary, increased area quantity is insanely good. 100% of it doubles your loot. Looked at in isolation, it's the best stat in the game. However, in reality, it's not always the best. I'll explain why a little bit later. First, we need to take a look at increased rare monsters. How does this compare to increased quantity? Increased rare monsters is a straightforward stat in terms of what it does. It increases the number of rare monsters that spawn. However, what's not so obvious is how this impacts your loot. How good this stat is tied directly to how much of your loot drops from rare monsters compared to all other sources. So unlike quantity, this is a stat I'd have to test a bit more thoroughly to have confidence to how much loot you gain from it. Here you can see I tested just shy of 52,000 monsters, testing between 0% increased rare monsters and an average of 143% increased rare monsters. I'll be focused on this right-hand column, which is the amount of loot you gained equalized for 100% increased rare monsters. For breach splinters, this is only up 5%, showing rare monsters don't contribute much to breach splinter drops. Next we see other currency, which is your lower level currency drops. My increase here was a modest 31% per 100. Moving on to the higher tier currency drops, you can see a more significant boost, up 62% per 100% of the stat. Moving to item drops, we see a somewhat similar story for rare items and unique items, up 52 and 55%. However, it makes no sense to me why tier 2 through 5 items would only be up 12%. My best guess for this right now would just be an unlucky streak tied with a smallish sample size. My guess is that if we increase the sample size significantly, that this would approach the 50% of the other two. If anyone has any other ideas, comment below. So in summary, breach splinters aren't impacted much, but the other items we care about are likely up 50 to 60% per 100% of the stat. So how does increased rarity compare to these? My entire last video is dedicated to increased area rarity, so check that out if you haven't already. Here are a few key points. If you don't have any increased rarity currently, getting some is very impactful. If you already have a lot, getting more is not helping you that much. To show this point in actual numbers, we'll go back to the dataset from my original player rarity videos. Here, with 26% rarity on my Atlas tree, going from 0 player rarity to 100 player rarity showed about a 66% increase in the number of rare currencies that dropped. Now, a big question I still have outstanding is to what extent can you replace player rarity with area rarity? I plan to test this sometime soon to figure that out, so look for that video in the future. For now, let's take a look at the main dataset I'll use to compare with rare monsters and quantity, which is increased area rarity. With a sample size of over 51,000 monsters, equalized to 100% rarity, my rare currency total only went up 15%. However, it's important to note that during this test, I had 206% player rarity. Looking at unidentified tier 2 through 5 and unique items, they're up 67% and 47% respectively, which is more in line with what we saw from the rare monster increase. Bringing it all together, how do these three stats compare? Well, it's important to note that different stats impact the different item categories differently. For example, increasing rare monsters and rarity doesn't have much, if any, impact on breach splinters, so depending on your strategy, how powerful these are to you will change. Again, I have all the data in my spreadsheets I've linked in the description, so you can take a look at it for yourself to see how it's going to impact your own strategies. But for the purposes to keep things simple for this video, I'll be focusing on how these stats impact rare currency drops. I've taken the data from my tests and compiled it into a rudimentary rare currency calculator. From this, we can more easily compare these stats and see the actual impact on juicing a map. Again, I think it's important to stress that this rarity number is based on my starting point of 206% player rarity and 26% Atlas rarity. It also calculates the increase as linear, which is wrong, but it'll give us a rough estimate for now. My dream is to have a calculator that could take a few rarity inputs and accurately predict the impact on drops, but we aren't all the way there yet. So for now, we'll be using this rough estimate. What does 100% of each stat do for us in terms of rare currency drops? As you can see, in a vacuum, increased quantity is superior. 100% is 100% more drops. Coming in second is increased rare monsters, which isn't that far behind at 62% of the efficiency of quant. Rarity in this case not having much impact, only increasing by 15% per 100. However, there are two main reasons why quantity is actually not always the best choice. The first has to do with the values seen on tablets and waystones. Here I've pulled the max values from tablets, and you can see quantity at 20%, rarity at 20%, and rare monsters at 15%. In this case, quantity is a no-brainer. However, waystones are a bit more interesting, with quantity coming as a dual stat of 29% quantity and 49% rarity. Rarity alone goes to 150%, and rare monsters go to 65%. Plugging these values into the calculator, we see that quantity and rare monsters are roughly the same, with rare monsters giving 40% more, where quantity is giving 38% more. However, due to them being this close to each other, I'd still pick quantity over rare monsters. This is due to its impact across all item categories, and the fact that you don't have to kill more rare monsters to get the loot. However, the most important aspect we haven't talked about, and why quantity is not always the best choice, is the additive nature of stacking a single stat. A lot of PoE players have this ingrained into their brains for increased damage. After the first couple 100%, it falls off and you start looking for multipliers instead. This works exactly the same for quantity. The more you're stacking it, the less impact it has. Let's take a look at an example where you already have 100% increased quantity. Adding 50% more does not give you 50% more loot. In this case, adding 50% more would actually only be increasing your loot by 25%. However, if we put 50% into rare monsters instead, our loot would go up by 31%. This gets even more dramatic as you get to 150% or even 200% quantity. Let's take a look at an example with 300% increased quantity. This would give us 4 times more loot. But let's say we've transferred 100% of that to rare monsters instead. This would now give us 4.9 times more loot. Again, I have a link to this in the description so you can play around with it yourself. I'll summarize this by giving my personal take on this with all the data I've collected so far. To start with, quantity is the best stat. However, as you reach high values, you'll want to start diversifying, with increased rare monsters seeming to be the best option. Increased rarity is just a huge asterisk, which I plan to keep testing. But so far, it doesn't appear that impactful after getting about 100% increased rarity on your gear and 20 to 25% from your Atlas. Likely, if you have 0% rarity on your gear, adding some to your map would have a bigger benefit. If you haven't already, you can check out my video on increased area rarity, and look for my next test where I'll be testing to see how big of a difference there is when replacing rarity on gear with rarity on map. And I want to keep this video under 10 minutes, so I'm out.